In the fading light of a prairie sunset, the town of Sagebrush Crossing holds its breath as 19-year-old Clara Sutton faces a choice that will define her entire life. Judge Horace Bly, a man with silver hair and darker intentions, has decided that Clara's refusal to accept his marriage proposal warrants the harshest punishment their small community can deliver. The cold waters of the Snake River have claimed many secrets over the years, and tonight they're meant to claim another. But watching from the shadows stands a weathered cowboy whose own buried grief won't let him turn away from an innocent in peril. What happens when a man who has spent years running from his past suddenly finds a reason to stand and fight? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Sagebrush Crossing, a town that seemed to exist in the space between yesterday's promises and tomorrow's uncertainties. Clara Sutton guided her mare through the familiar ritual of checking fence posts along the northern boundary of her family's ranch. The same route her father had ridden every morning for 23 years before consumption claimed him last winter. The leather reins felt solid in her calloused hands, a connection to the land that had shaped 3 generations of Suttons before her. At 19, Clara possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from facing hardship without flinching. Her auburn hair, often braided to keep it from her face during long days of ranch work, caught the morning light as she dismounted to examine a section of fence that needed mending. The Sutton Ranch stretched along the most coveted piece of land in the county, a mile-long stretch where the Snake River curved through rich bottomland, providing both water rights and the finest grazing in 3 counties. Her father had built this place from nothing, arriving in Sagebrush Crossing as a young man with little more than determination and a belief that honest work could carve out a decent life from the unforgiving prairie. He'd courted and married Clara's mother, Elizabeth, in the town's small church, and together they'd raised cattle, planted crops, and raised their daughter to understand that the land was both a blessing and a responsibility. Elizabeth had died when Clara was 12, taken by the same fever that swept through the territory that harsh winter. Clara still remembered her mother's gentle hands, teaching her to braid rope, to read the sky for weather, to understand that strength wasn't about never falling down, it was about getting back up with grace and dignity intact. Now, 3 months after burying her father beside her mother in the small cemetery overlooking the river, Clara faced each day with the sobering knowledge that she was the last of her line. The ranch papers were in her name, legally and properly filed, but in a territory where unmarried women rarely managed large properties alone, she felt the weight of constant scrutiny from the town's established families. Judge Horace Bly had made his intentions clear from the moment the last shovel of dirt covered her father's grave. A widower himself, 15 years her senior, he'd approached her with what he called a practical arrangement. His own wife had died childless 5 years earlier, leaving him with a large house, considerable wealth, and what he termed a need for companionship and someone to manage domestic affairs. Clara had listened to his proposal with the courtesy her father had taught her, then declined with the same quiet dignity her mother had modeled. But Judge Bly was not a man accustomed to hearing no. As the territory's appointed magistrate, he wielded power that extended far beyond the courtroom. Over the past 2 months, he'd made it increasingly clear that her refusal would have consequences. The formal rejection letter she delivered to his office, yesterday written in her careful script on paper purchased from the town's general store, had been her final, definitive answer. She'd watched his face change as he read her words, seen the dangerous flicker behind his pale eyes, and understood that she'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. Meanwhile, 50 yards from where Clara mended fence, a weathered cowboy named Everett Cole was making his own morning inspection of the horses corralled behind Morrison's livery stable. At 43, Everett carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. His face, bronzed by decades of sun and wind, bore the kind of lines that spoke of squinting into distant horizons and weathering storms, both literal and figurative. Everett's worn leather saddlebags, draped over the corral fence, contained everything he owned of value: his tools, his few spare clothes, and tucked deep in the bottom compartment, a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in a child's careful handwriting, each one beginning, "Dear Papa," and signed, "Your loving daughter, Sarah." Sarah would have been 22 now, if the fever hadn't taken her when she was 8. Everett had been 200 miles away, driving cattle to market in Denver, when the sickness swept through their small Kansas town. By the time he returned, his wife had buried their daughter and left him a note explaining that she couldn't bear to look at him anymore, knowing that if he'd been home, if he'd chosen family over the constant call of the trail, their child might have lived. For 15 years, Everett had carried that guilt like a stone in his chest. He'd become a wanderer, following cattle drives, breaking horses, taking whatever work kept him moving. He'd developed a reputation as a man who could gentle the wildest bronc, who knew cattle like some men knew scripture, and who could be counted on to do his job without complaint or unnecessary conversation. Each spring for the past 5 years, he'd brought a string of horses to Sagebrush Crossing, selling them to local ranchers before moving on to the next town, the next job, the next horizon. He preferred the edges of communities, the spaces between belonging and leaving, where a man could be useful without being known. Judge Bly had ruled Sagebrush Crossing with an iron fist disguised as legal authority for nearly a decade. A man of imposing height and silver hair that he kept perfectly groomed, he understood that power lay not just in the law, but in the careful cultivation of fear and dependence. The townspeople had learned to defer to his judgment, to accept his interpretations of territorial law, and to avoid crossing him in matters both large and small. His late wife, Margaret, had been a gentlewoman who'd seemed to soften his harder edges, but her death had removed the last constraint on his ambitions and appetites. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, his rulings had become more arbitrary, his demands more personal, his punishments more severe. The concept of water justice was Judge Bly's own innovation, a punishment he claimed was rooted in ancient legal tradition, but which served primarily to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through conventional legal channels. Those who found themselves subject to water justice were bound and thrown into the Snake River at a point where the current ran swift and deep. If they survived, the judge proclaimed, it was evidence of divine intervention and their innocence. If they drowned, it was proof that justice had been served. In 5 years, 3 people had faced water justice in Sagebrush Crossing. None had survived. The townspeople had watched in horrified silence, telling themselves that the victims must have been guilty of something, that Judge Bly's wisdom exceeded their understanding, that questioning such decisions was not their place. The town's merchants, farmers, and families had built their lives around avoiding the judge's displeasure. They paid their taxes promptly, settled their disputes without appeal, and kept their opinions to themselves. It was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth that they'd allowed their community to be ruled by fear rather than justice. Morrison, the livery stable owner, was typical of Sagebrush Crossing's residents. A decent man who worked hard and treated his customers fairly, he'd nonetheless watched 2 of the water justice sentences without speaking up. He told himself that he had a family to protect, a business to maintain, and that one man's voice wouldn't matter against the judge's authority. As Everett examined the horses that morning, Morrison approached with the nervous energy of a man wrestling with his conscience. "That Sutton girl," Morrison said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Word is the judge is mighty displeased with her." Everett didn't look up from checking a bay mare's hooves. "Not my concern." "Judge called for a town meeting tonight," Morrison continued. "Says there's been a matter of disrespect that needs addressing." This time Everett did look up, his weathered face showing nothing but mild interest. "Meeting's not for me. I'll be moving on tomorrow." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "She's just a girl, Trying to hold on to her daddy's place seems harsh, whatever he's planning. Everett returned to his work, but Morrison's words settled uneasily in his mind. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, he found himself walking past the Sutton ranch rather than preparing for departure. Through the kitchen window, he could see Clara sitting at a wooden table, her head bent over what appeared to be paperwork. Something about the sight a young woman alone, trying to manage burdens that seemed too heavy for her shoulders stirred memories he'd spent years trying to bury. For just a moment, he saw not Clara Sutton but his own daughter, Sarah, bent over her school lessons at their kitchen table, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on forming letters. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and he turned away, walking quickly back toward town. But the image stayed with him as evening fell, and the people of Sagebrush Crossing gathered for Judge Bligh's meeting, their faces marked by the particular tension that came from knowing something terrible was about to happen and feeling powerless to stop it. The town hall fell silent as Judge Bligh rose from his carved wooden chair, Clara's rejection letter held between his fingers like evidence in a capital case. The paper trembled slightly not from nervousness, but from barely controlled rage that had been building since he'd first read her carefully worded refusal that morning. Citizens of Sagebrush Crossing, his voice carried the authority of a decade's unchallenged rule. We are gathered tonight to address a matter of grave disrespect to the lawful authority of this territory. Clara sat in the third row, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the weight of 30 pairs of eyes upon her. She'd known this moment would come from the instant she'd signed her name to that letter. Her father had taught her that some battles couldn't be avoided, only faced with dignity. Miss Clara Sutton, Judge Bligh continued, his pale eyes finding her in the crowd, has chosen to publicly reject not merely a generous offer of marriage, but the very order that keeps our community civilized and prosperous. A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles went white. They all understood the language Judge Bligh was speaking, the careful building of a case that would justify whatever punishment he'd already decided upon. Her father, God rest his soul, was a good man who understood the importance of cooperation and respect for legitimate authority. But his daughter has chosen a different path. The judge's voice grew harder with each word. She has insulted not just me personally, but the very foundations upon which our society rests. Clara stood, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed room. Your Honor, I meant no disrespect to the law or to this community. I simply exercised my right to decline a marriage proposal, as is the right of any free woman in this territory. Judge Bligh's smile was thin and cold. Rights, Miss Sutton? You speak of rights as if they exist independent of the order that protects them. Your ranch sits on the finest land in this county, land that requires proper management, proper protection. A young woman alone cannot possibly... I have managed that ranch successfully for 3 months since my father's death, Clara interrupted, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. The cattle are healthy, the bills are paid, and the land is well tended. I ask nothing from this community except to be left in peace to continue my family's work. The judge's facade of legal propriety began to crack. Peace. You speak of peace while flouting the natural order, while rejecting the guidance of your betters, while setting an example that threatens the stability of every family in this town. He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising. What happens when other young women decide they too can reject the wisdom of their elders? What happens when wives decide they no longer need husbands? When daughters ignore their fathers? When the very fabric of Christian society unravels because one stubborn girl thinks her desires matter more than community welfare? Clara felt the room's energy shift against her. These were good people, mostly, but they were frightened people who'd learned to survive by not making waves, by deferring to authority, even when that authority felt wrong in their bones. I have done nothing illegal, she said louder now. I have harmed no one. I have simply chosen to remain unmarried and independent, which is my right under territorial law." "Your right?" Judge Bly's voice cracked like a whip. "Your rights end where community welfare begins, and I have determined that your continued defiance threatens the very foundations of order in Sagebrush Crossing." He reached beneath his podium and withdrew a coil of rough hemp rope, holding it up for all to see. The binding rope was thick and coarse, the kind used for securing livestock or heavy cargo. Several people in the audience gasped, understanding immediately what its presence meant. "Therefore," Judge Bly declared, "I sentence Clara Sutton to face water justice for the crime of willful defiance of lawful authority and corruption of public morals." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and nervous whispers. Water justice hadn't been invoked in over a year, and never against someone so young, so clearly innocent of any real wrongdoing. But Clara had anticipated this moment, had prepared herself for it during the long, sleepless night after delivering her rejection letter. "I submit to the judgment of this court," she said clearly, "and I pray that God will judge between us." Her composure, in the face of what amounted to a death sentence, sent a chill through the assembled townspeople. This wasn't the desperate pleading they'd witnessed before. Clara faced her fate with a dignity that made some of them, for the first time in years, question whether they were witnessing justice or something far darker. Judge Bly's satisfaction was evident as he nodded to his two enforcers, men who served as both bailiffs and executioners when the need arose. "The sentence will be carried out immediately while the moon provides sufficient light." Outside, unknown to everyone in that stuffy town hall, Everett Cole sat on a hay bale behind Morrison's livery stable, ostensibly checking his gear for tomorrow's departure. But the voices from the meeting carried clearly on the still night air, and every word of the proceedings had reached his ears with perfect clarity. When he heard Judge Bly pronounce the sentence of water justice, something deep in his chest seemed to crack open a place he'd kept sealed for 15 years. He saw again his daughter's face, trusting and innocent, and heard again his wife's final words about choosing the trail over family, about being absent when protection was needed most. The crowd began to emerge from the town hall, moving with the reluctant momentum of people who knew they were about to witness something terrible but felt powerless to prevent it. Clara walked between the two enforcers, with her head held high, her hands already bound behind her back with Judge Bly's rope. Everett had intended to be gone before dawn, to put Sagebrush Crossing behind him like he had dozens of other towns. But as he watched 19-year-old Clara Sutton walk toward what everyone expected to be her death, he found he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't turn away from the scene unfolding before him. The procession moved toward the Snake River, where the current ran deep and fast through a narrow channel between high banks. The moon cast everything in silver and shadow, lending an otherworldly quality to the grim proceedings. Judge Bly walked at the front, his bearing suggesting a man performing a necessary but distasteful duty rather than a corrupt official eliminating a threat to his power. At the water's edge, Clara was given a moment to speak any final words. Her voice carried clearly across the water. "I forgive you all, and I pray that my death will trouble your consciences enough to prevent this from happening to another innocent soul." Then the enforcers lifted her between them and threw her into the black water. The splash seemed impossibly loud, followed by silence, broken only by the sound of the current and the nervous shuffling of feet on the riverbank. The crowd waited the traditional few minutes to confirm that divine intervention would not occur, then began to disperse with the uncomfortable haste of people eager to put distance between themselves and their complicity in what they'd just witnessed. But Everett Cole had already begun moving downstream, following the river's path through the darkness, driven by a need he couldn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. For the first time in 15 years, he was running toward something instead of away from it. The Snake River's current carried Clara downstream faster than Everett had anticipated. He followed the winding path along the bank, his boots finding purchase on rocks and fallen logs as he moved through the moonlit darkness. The sound of rushing water masked his approach, but it also made it harder to hear Clara's struggles in the black current ahead. 200 yards from where she'd been thrown in, the river curved around a bend where sandbars and fallen cottonwoods created a natural barrier that slowed the water's flow. Everett reached the spot just as Clara's bound form swept past a partially submerged log, her head barely above the surface, her strength clearly failing. Without hesitation, he waded into the icy water, the current immediately threatening to sweep him downstream as well. Clara had managed to hook her bound arms around a branch, but her grip was weakening and the rope was cutting into her wrists as she fought to keep her head above water. "Easy now," Everett said as he reached her, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "I've got you." Clara's eyes were wide with shock and the beginnings of hypothermia, but she managed to nod as Everett worked to free her from the branch and guide her toward the shore. The binding rope had swollen in the water, making it harder to untie, but his weathered hands made quick work of the knots. Once on dry ground, Clara collapsed to her knees, coughing up river water and shivering violently. Everett stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then helped her to a sheltered spot among the cottonwoods where they'd be hidden from anyone who might come looking. "They think I'm dead," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from the water she'd swallowed. "They'll have already gone back to town." Everett nodded, building a small fire from dead branches and dry grass. "That's what we want them to think, at least for now. But we need to get you warm and figure out what comes next." As the flames caught and began to throw heat, Clara studied the man who'd saved her life. She'd seen him around town during his spring visits, but they'd never spoken. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors, and his movements had an economy that suggested someone accustomed to handling emergencies without panic. "Why?" she asked simply. Everett poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting her eyes. "Wrong place at the right time, I guess." "No," Clara said, her voice stronger now. "You followed the river. You were waiting for me. Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant murmur of the river. Then Everett reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, worn daguerreotype photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a shy smile. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "She would have been about your age now if she'd lived." Clara took the photograph with careful hands, studying the child's face. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her when she was 8. I was 200 miles away, driving cattle to market. By the time I got home, she was already buried and her mother was gone too. Left me a note saying she couldn't bear to look at me anymore, knowing that if I'd been there, if I'd chosen family over the trail, our daughter might have lived." The pain in his voice was so raw that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. She handed the photograph back to him, understanding now why he'd risked everything to save her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've been running from that guilt for 15 years, Everett continued. "Told myself it was easier to keep moving, to not get attached to places or people. But watching you face that sentence tonight, seeing the way you held your head up even when they threw you in the river, it reminded me that sometimes a man has to choose between what's easy and what's right." Clara pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling warmth returning to her limbs. "What happens now? I can't go back to town. Judge Bly will never let me live in peace, and now that I've survived his water justice, he'll find another way to get rid of me." "Maybe," Everett said. "Or maybe it's time someone stood up to him." "You don't understand," Clara said urgently. "He's not just corrupt, he's completely ruthless. Those people in that town hall tonight, they're not evil, they're scared. He's broken their spirits over the years, made them believe that resistance is hopeless." Everett looked at her with new respect. Despite everything she'd been through, Clara was thinking about the welfare of the community that had just tried to execute her. "You're talking about going back." "I'm talking about not running away," Clara said firmly. "This is my home. My parents are buried here. My ranch is here. Judge Bly doesn't get to drive me away from everything I love just because he's decided he wants what's mine. Going back means facing him again, and next time he won't bother with the pretense of water justice. He'll just have you shot." Clara reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the land deed to her ranch, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from water damage. This is what he really wants. Not me, not marriage, my land, the riverfront property that's worth more than anything else in the county. You kept that with you? My father taught me to always carry the deed when I left the ranch. He said a person's claim to their land was only as good as their ability to prove it. She smoothed the document carefully. Judge Bly can't get this property through marriage if I'm dead, but he can probably find a way to claim it through some legal maneuvering if I disappear permanently. Everett studied her face in the firelight. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing that we go back to Sagebrush Crossing, together, Sunday morning, when everyone gathers for weekly meeting. I want to walk into that church very much alive, with this deed in my pocket and a witness to testify about what really happened tonight. That's assuming the townspeople will listen. They've been letting Judge Bly get away with murder for years. Maybe, Clara said, but maybe seeing someone survive his justice will make them realize they don't have to be afraid anymore. Maybe they'll find the courage to stand up if someone shows them it's possible. Everett was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally, he said, I was planning to leave Sagebrush Crossing tomorrow morning. Haven't stayed in one place longer than a few weeks in 15 years. I know, Clara said softly, and I'm not asking you to change your whole life for me. I'm just asking you to stay long enough to help me try to make things right. If we do this, if we go back, there's no halfway measures. Judge Bly will try to destroy both of us. You ready for that kind of fight? Clara looked down at the photograph he still held, then back at his weathered face. Are you? For the first time in 15 years, Everett Cole smiled with something approaching hope. I reckon I am. They spent the rest of the night by the fire, planning their approach and sharing stories that helped them understand each other's strength and resolve. As dawn approached, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the sense that she wasn't facing her battles alone. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern mountains when they finally prepared to make their way back toward town. Clara folded her father's land deed carefully and placed it in her pocket, while Everett checked his pistol and settled his hat low over his eyes. You sure about this? He asked one final time. Clara looked back at the river that had nearly claimed her life, then toward the town that had tried to execute her. I'm sure, she said. It's time Sagebrush Crossing learned what real justice looks like. The bronze bell atop Sagebrush Crossing's small church had called the community to Sunday worship for 12 years, its clear tone carrying across the prairie every week without fail. This particular Sunday morning, however, the bell's call seemed to carry an additional weight as if the very air knew that something momentous was about to unfold. Clara and Everett approached the town from the east, using the cover of morning shadows and the abandoned Hendricks homestead to avoid being seen before they were ready. The church sat at the heart of Sagebrush Crossing, a simple wooden structure with a steeple that served as both bell tower and the community's highest point. Most everyone will be there, Clara said as they watched families making their way toward the church. Judge Bly makes attendance mandatory for all respectable citizens, says it's important for maintaining moral order. Everett adjusted his hat and checked his pistol one more time. How do you want to play this? We wait until the service begins, then walk in during the opening hymn. I want them to see me alive before Judge Bly has a chance to control the situation. They could see Judge Bly himself approaching the church, dressed in his finest black suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed he'd eliminated a problem and restored order to his domain. Behind him came his two enforcers, looking somewhat less comfortable in their Sunday clothes but still vigilant. There's Morrison. Clara pointed to the livery stable owner, helping his wife down from their wagon. And Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher. These are good people, Everett. Scared people, but good people underneath. The bell began its final call, and they watched the last few stragglers hurry into the church. Through the open windows, they could hear the rustle of people settling into pews and the shuffling of feet on wooden floors. Judge Bly always sits in the front pew, Clara explained. Claims it's to show proper respect for the Lord, but really it's so he can watch everyone during the service. He'll be facing away from the door when we enter. The opening hymn began, "Abide with me," and Clara felt a bitter irony in the choice. The congregation's voices rose together, creating the kind of communal sound that should have brought comfort, but instead highlighted how isolated she'd become from her own community. "Now," Clara said, and they moved from their hiding place toward the church. Every step felt significant as they crossed the dusty street and approached the church steps. Clara could feel her heart pounding, but her resolve remained steady. The land deed in her pocket seemed to give her strength, a tangible reminder of what she was fighting for. They paused at the church door, the hymn continuing inside. Through the windows, Clara could see the backs of heads, families sitting together, children fidgeting in their Sunday clothes. These people had watched her near execution the night before, had gone home to their beds while believing she was dead. "Ready?" Everett whispered. Clara nodded and pushed open the door. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The hymn faltered as voices dropped away one by one, people turning in their pews to stare at the impossible sight of Clara Sutton walking into their church very much alive. By the time she and Everett had taken 3 steps down the center aisle, complete silence had fallen over the congregation. Judge Bly, seated in the front pew as predicted, turned slowly to see what had caused the disruption. When his eyes fell on Clara, his face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and something that might have been fear before settling into cold fury. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I apologize for interrupting your worship, but I wanted to let everyone know that I survived Judge Bly's water justice. By his own rules, that means God has declared me innocent." A murmur ran through the congregation, nervous whispers and sharp intakes of breath. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, while Morrison gripped the back of the pew in front of him until his knuckles went white. Judge Bly rose slowly, his composure returning as he prepared to reassert control. "Miss Sutton," he said with deliberate calm, "your presence here is most irregular. The sentence of water justice was properly carried out, and if you somehow survived through trickery or assistance, it merely means the matter requires more thorough resolution." "Trickery?" Clara stepped forward, Everett beside her. "The only trickery here is your perversion of justice. You sentenced me to death, not because I committed any crime, but because I refused to marry you and give you access to my ranch." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Several people in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth they'd all known but been afraid to acknowledge. "You speak of matters beyond your understanding," Judge Bly said, his voice gaining strength. "The welfare of this community requires difficult decisions, decisions that young women are not equipped to make." "Then let the community decide," Clara said, turning to address the congregation directly. "You all know me. You knew my parents. Have I ever given you cause to believe I'm immoral or dangerous? Have I ever harmed anyone in this town?" Silence stretched through the church, broken only by the sound of children shuffling and the distant call of a meadowlark outside. Clara could see the internal struggle playing out on familiar faces, the desire to speak truth, warring with years of learned fear. Finally, Mrs. Patterson stood up in her pew. Her voice was shaky but clear. "Clara Sutton is a good girl from a good family. She's never caused trouble for anyone." Judge Bly's eyes fixed on the schoolteacher with unmistakable menace. "Mrs. Patterson, you would do well to remember your position in this community and the importance of supporting lawful authority." But Mrs. Patterson's courage seemed to unlock something in the others. Morrison cleared his throat and said, "Judge, with respect, throwing a young woman in the river for refusing a marriage proposal doesn't seem much like justice to most folks." "Are you questioning my authority, Morrison?" The judge's voice carried a clear threat. "I'm questioning whether what happened last night was right," Morrison replied, his voice gaining strength. "And seeing Clara here alive makes me think maybe God agrees with me." Everett stepped forward, his presence adding weight to Clara's cause. "I was there last night. I saw what happened. This wasn't justice, it was attempted murder dressed up in legal language." Judge Bly's composure finally cracked. "You have no standing in this community, stranger. Your interference in lawful proceedings makes you an accessory to contempt of court." "Maybe," Everett said calmly, "but I also have eyes to see and a conscience to listen to, and both tell me that what you did last night was wrong." The judge turned back to the congregation, trying to regain control. "This man is a drifter, a troublemaker who has no investment in our community's welfare. Will you let him and this stubborn girl undermine the order that has kept Sagebrush Crossing peaceful and prosperous?" But something had shifted in the room. Clara could see it in the way people were sitting straighter, looking at each other, instead of keeping their eyes down. The spell of fear that had held the community for so long was beginning to break. "Judge Bly," Clara said clearly, "I challenge you to explain to this congregation exactly what crime I committed that warranted a death sentence. Tell them what law I broke by refusing your marriage proposal." The challenge hung in the air, and Clara could see that Judge Bly knew he was trapped. His authority had always depended on people being too frightened to ask direct questions or demand specific justifications. "The law," he said slowly, "is more complex than simple minds can understand. My authority comes from the territorial government, and my decisions are not subject to debate by untrained civilians." "But they are subject to God's judgment," Clara replied. "And according to your own rules about water justice, God has judged me innocent." The bronze bell chose that moment to ring again, not its regular call to worship, but a single, clear note that seemed to hang in the air like a declaration. In the silence that followed, Clara could feel the balance of power in Sagebrush Crossing beginning to shift for the first time in years. That evening, as the sun painted the prairie sky in shades of gold and crimson, Everett sat beside his small campfire outside town, his fingers gently touching the faded blue ribbon that had belonged to his daughter Sarah. The ribbon was all he had left of her Sunday dresses, saved from the fever that had taken her life 15 years ago. Clara had returned to her ranch to assess what damage Judge Bly might have inflicted during her supposed death, while Everett chose to maintain his camp in the cottonwoods by the river. Old habits died hard, and he wasn't ready to sleep under a roof when trouble was still brewing. "Papa, are you brave?" Sarah had asked him once when she was 6 years old, and he was preparing to leave for another cattle drive. She'd been playing with this very ribbon, weaving it through her auburn hair that caught the lamplight, just like Clara's did. "Brave enough," he'd answered, kissing her forehead. "But the bravest thing a man can do is come home to the people who love him." He'd failed to do that. Failed to choose home over the horizon, family over the freedom of the trail, and Sarah had paid the price for his choices. But watching Clara face down Judge Bly in that church, seeing her stand up for what was right despite the danger, had awakened something in him that he'd thought was buried forever. Maybe it wasn't too late to choose differently. Maybe protecting someone else's daughter could somehow honor the memory of his own. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Clara emerged from the darkness, her mare picking its way carefully through the riverside brush. She dismounted and led her horse to the water's edge to drink. "How was the ranch?" Everett asked. "Untouched, surprisingly. I think Judge Bly was so confident I was dead that he didn't bother posting guards or searching the property." Clara settled beside the fire, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "But that won't last long. Now that I'm alive and making noise, he'll move more aggressively. The townspeople seem to be listening today. Some of them. But listening and acting are different things. Judge Bly has controlled their lives for so long that most of them don't know how to imagine things being different." Everett studied her face in the firelight. Despite everything she'd been through, Clara radiated a quiet strength that reminded him painfully of Sarah's mother in their early days together, before grief and blame had torn them apart. "Tell me about your daughter," Clara said softly. "Really tell me. What was she like?" Everett was quiet for a long moment, fingering the ribbon. She was curious about everything, always asking questions. Why do horses sleep standing up? Why do stars come out at night? Why do some people have more than others? She had this way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Like this, Clara tilted her head slightly, and Everett felt his breath catch. "Just like that," He cleared his throat. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, said she liked helping people understand things they didn't know before. She sounds wonderful. She was, and I missed too much of her growing up, always chasing the next job, the next trail. I told myself I was providing for her, but really I was just running from the responsibility of being present. Clara was quiet, letting him talk at his own pace. When the fever came, I was in Denver with a herd of cattle. Could have been home in 3 days if I'd pushed hard, but I stayed to negotiate a better price. Always trying to squeeze out a little more profit, a little more success. By the time I got back, she'd been in the ground for a week. The fever was fast that year, Clara said gently. Even if you'd been home, you might not have been able to save her. That's what the doctor said. That's what the preacher said. But my wife, she knew better. She knew that if I'd been there, I'd have gotten Sarah to the doctor sooner, would have fought harder, would have done something. Instead, I was 200 miles away, caring more about cattle than about my own child. Is that why you keep moving? To punish yourself? Everett looked at her with surprise. Most people don't see it that way. Most people haven't had to choose between running away and staying to fight. I understand the temptation to keep moving, to think that the next place might hurt less than the last one. But you chose to stay. I chose to stay because running wouldn't bring my parents back or honor what they built. And maybe, she paused, looking into the fire, maybe because I didn't want to become someone who was always leaving. The weight of her words settled between them. Everett realized that Clara had seen straight through to the heart of his 15-year flight, from responsibility, from connection, from the risk of caring about someone enough to lose them. Judge Bly won't give up, he said, changing the subject. What happened in church today wounded his pride, but it also made him desperate. Desperate men do dangerous things. I know. He'll try to discredit me, claim I'm unstable or immoral. If that doesn't work, he'll find some legal pretext to seize my ranch. And if all else fails, he'll have you killed and make it look like an accident. Clara nodded grimly. The question is whether we can build enough support in the community to protect ourselves. People are scared, but they're also starting to get angry. Morrison seemed ready to speak up. Morrison's a good man, but he's got a family to protect. Mrs. Patterson showed real courage today, but she's just one person. We need more allies, and we need them fast. Everett pulled out his daughter's ribbon again, running the silk through his fingers. Sarah used to say that courage was like a candle flamite, could spread from one person to another if you held them close enough together. Smart girl. She was, and I think she'd want me to help you light some candles. Clara smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since this ordeal began. What did you have in mind? Judge Bly's power comes from fear and isolation. He keeps people apart, makes them feel like they're the only ones who have doubts. But if we can get them talking to each other, sharing their concerns, they might realize they're not alone. A town meeting? Not official. Something informal, private. Give people a chance to speak their minds without Judge Bly controlling the conversation. Clara considered this. It's risky. If he finds out we're organizing behind his back, he'll move against us immediately. Maybe. But doing nothing is just as dangerous. And at least this way, we're moving towards something instead of just reacting to his attacks. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound carried a loneliness that seemed to echo Everett's own long years of solitude. There's something else, Clara said quietly. Something I need to tell you about Judge Bly. What is it? When I was going through my father's papers after he died, I found some correspondence that troubled me. Letters between my father and a lawyer in the territorial capital, asking questions about property rights and judicial authority. Everett looked up from the ribbon. What kind of questions? Questions about whether a territorial judge could override federal land grants, whether water justice had any basis in actual law, whether the territorial government knew what Judge Bly was doing in Sagebrush Crossing. And what did the lawyer say? That's just it. The correspondence stopped abruptly about 6 months before my father died. The last letter from the lawyer warned my father to be careful, said that challenging Judge Bly's authority could be dangerous. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If Clara's father had died of natural causes, the timing was certainly convenient for Judge Bly. And if he hadn't, you think Judge Bly might have killed your father? I think my father was asking the right questions, and I think Judge Bly has killed people for less. But I can't prove anything, and accusations without proof would just make me look desperate. Everett was quiet for a long time, thinking about Sarah, about the choices that had led him here, about the difference between running away and standing to fight. Then we'll have to be very careful, he said finally, and very smart, because if Judge Bly killed your father, he won't hesitate to kill us both. Clara reached over and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them. I'm sorry I'm asking you to stay for this. I know it goes against everything you've done for the past 15 years. Everett looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. Maybe it's time I stopped running away from things that matter. The faded blue ribbon fluttered in the evening breeze, and for just a moment, Everett could almost hear Sarah's voice whispering across the years. Come home, Papa. Come home. Judge Horace Bly's ornate wooden gavel had been carved from walnut by the territory's finest craftsmen, its head engraved with scales of justice that gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through his office windows. For 10 years, that gavel had been the symbol of absolute authority in Sagebrush Crossing, its sound striking fear into anyone who dared challenge the established order. Now, as Judge Bly held it in his trembling hands, the weight of it felt different. Clara Sutton's survival and public defiance had cracked something fundamental in the foundation of his power, and he could feel the ground shifting beneath him like sand in a river current. His two enforcers, Briggs and Coleman, stood before his desk with the uncomfortable posture of men who'd failed in their primary duty. They'd thrown Clara into the Snake River as ordered, had waited the appropriate time to confirm her death, and had reported the successful completion of their task. Her miraculous appearance in church the previous morning had caught them as off guard as everyone else. Tell me again how she could have survived, Judge Bly said, his voice dangerously quiet. Judge, we did everything exactly like always. Briggs said, shifting his weight nervously. Bound her hands proper, threw her in at the deep channel where the current runs fastest. Ain't no way she could have swum out of that on her own. Which means she had help. The judge's pale eyes fixed on Coleman. And who in this town would dare interfere with the execution of legal justice? That cowboy, Coleman answered immediately. The one who brings horses each spring. He was in church with her, standing right beside her like they'd planned it. Judge Bly set the gavel down with deliberate care. Everett Cole had been coming to Sagebrush Crossing for 5 years, always keeping to himself, conducting his business quietly and moving on without causing trouble. But something had changed this time, and the judge needed to understand what had motivated a drifter to risk his life for a local girl. What do we know about Cole? Not much, Briggs admitted. Morrison says he's good with horses, pays his bills, don't cause trouble, but he don't talk much about his past or where he goes when he leaves here. Everyone has a past, Judge Bly said thoughtfully, and everyone has something they're running from. Find out what Cole's secrets are. Find out why he's suddenly developed a conscience. The judge rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the town's main street. Below, he could see the ordinary rhythm of daily life merchants opening their shops, children playing in the dust, housewives hanging laundry. But underneath the surface normalcy, he sensed a dangerous undercurrent of change. There's talk, Coleman said hesitantly. What kind of talk? People asking questions about water justice, about whether it's really legal. Mrs. Patterson's been telling folks that Clara never did nothing wrong, and Morrison's been saying maybe it's time the territorial government knew what was happening here. Judge Bly's hands clenched into fists. For 10 years, he'd maintained control through a careful balance of fear, legal authority, and the townspeople's natural reluctance to challenge established power. But Clara's survival had created a crack in that foundation, and now doubt was seeping through like water through a broken dam. Double the patrols around the Sutton Ranch, he ordered. I want to know everyone who comes and goes, and spread the word that anyone caught meeting with Clara Sutton or Everett Cole will be considered accomplices to contempt of court. Yes, sir, both men replied, but Judge Bly could hear the uncertainty in their voices. After they left, the judge sat alone in his office, staring at the gavel that had served him so well for so long. The truth was that his authority in Sagebrush Crossing had always been somewhat questionable. The territorial government had appointed him as a circuit judge, expecting him to travel between communities and hold court where needed. Instead, he'd established himself permanently in Sagebrush Crossing, gradually expanding his power beyond what was legally prescribed. Water justice, his signature punishment, had no basis in territorial or federal law. He'd invented it as a way to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through conventional legal channels, and the townspeople had accepted it because they were isolated, frightened, and had no easy way to appeal his decisions to higher authorities. But Clara's father had been asking the right questions before his death. The letters Judge Bly had intercepted, and that he'd assumed died with the old man, had been making inquiries that could have exposed the illegal nature of much of what happened in Sagebrush Crossing. The judge opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small vial of clear liquid, the same substance he'd used to hasten Clara's father's death when consumption had been taking too long to silence the inconvenient questions. It had been undetectable, mimicking the progression of natural disease, and no one had suspected anything beyond the tragedy of a good man dying too young. Now he faced a more complex problem. Clara herself was asking questions, backed by a mysterious cowboy who'd shown unexpected courage and competence. And the townspeople, cowed for so long, were beginning to remember that they outnumbered their oppressors. A knock at his door interrupted his dark thoughts. Enter. Mrs. Patterson stepped into his office, her usual deference replaced by something that looked disturbingly like determination. As the town's schoolteacher, she occupied a position of respect that made her potential opposition particularly dangerous. Judge Bly, she said formally, I've come to discuss yesterday's events. Have you now? He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please, sit down. Mrs. Patterson remained standing. I've been thinking about what happened in church yesterday, and I believe an apology is owed. For a moment, hope flickered in the judge's chest. If the schoolteacher was ready to recant her support for Clara Sutton deserves an apology from this entire community, Mrs. Patterson continued. We stood by and watched you try to murder an innocent girl, and our silence made us complicit in that crime. The judge's face darkened. Mrs. Patterson, you would do well to remember that your position in this community depends upon my recommendation. The Territorial Education Board takes a dim view of teachers who demonstrate poor judgment and questionable moral character. My moral character? Mrs. Patterson's voice rose slightly. Judge, I've been teaching the children of this community for 8 years. I've watched them grow, helped them learn not just reading and arithmetic, but the difference between right and wrong. And yesterday, I watched their parents participate in something that was fundamentally, undeniably wrong. The administration of justice is complex. There was nothing complex about what happened. You tried to kill Clara Sutton because she wouldn't marry you and give you access to her ranch. That's not justice, that's murder disguised as law. Judge Bly rose slowly, his impressive height intended to intimidate. But Mrs. Patterson held her ground, her grey hair pulled back severely, her spine straight with moral conviction. Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your position. This community needs stability, needs respect for legitimate authority. Your continued employment, your standing among decent families, your very safety, all of these things depend upon your willingness to support rather than undermine the order that keeps Sagebrush Crossing peaceful. Are you threatening me, Judge? I'm offering you guidance, the same guidance I offered Clara Sutton before she chose the path of defiance. Mrs. Patterson looked him straight in the eye. Then I choose defiance as well, and I'll be telling the Territorial Education Board about our conversation when I write to them next week. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the silent office. Judge Bly watched her go, his mind already calculating the implications of her rebellion. "Mrs. Patterson," he called as she reached the door. She turned back. "I hope you understand the consequences of the choice you're making." "I understand them perfectly," she replied, "and I'll live with them more easily than I could live with continuing to stay silent." After she left, Judge Bly sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. The gavel on his desk no longer seemed like a symbol of power, it looked more like a relic of a dying age. But he wasn't finished yet. If he couldn't maintain control through fear and legal authority, he'd have to find other methods, more direct methods, more permanent solutions. He opened his desk drawer again and began planning how to eliminate both Clara Sutton and Everett Cole before their rebellion could spread any further. Sometimes, he reflected, the only way to restore order was to remind people what happened to those who chose chaos. The hidden marriage certificate lay buried beneath a stack of territorial land records in the courthouse basement, yellowed with age and bearing the official seal of the territorial government. Clara's hands trembled as she held the document up to the lamplight, reading the names that made her stomach turn with a mixture of horror and understanding. Horace Bly and Elizabeth Sutton, married in secret ceremony, June 15th, 1854. 3 months before her mother had married Clara's father. Everett stood beside her in the dusty records room, his face grim as he absorbed the implications of their discovery. They'd come to the courthouse before dawn, using Clara's knowledge of the building's layout to search for any evidence that might explain Judge Bly's obsession with her and her ranch. "Your mother was married to him first," Everett said quietly. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "She never told my father, never told me. All these years I thought—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The certificate told a story that recontextualized everything Clara thought she knew about her family's history. Judge Bly hadn't been making arbitrary advances toward a young woman. He'd been pursuing what he believed was his rightful claim to a wife who had betrayed him and a daughter who carried his legal name. "Look at the date," Everett pointed to the marriage record. "June 1854. When did your parents marry?" Clara pulled out her parents' marriage certificate from her saddlebag, the document she'd treasured as proof of their love story. The date was September 15th, 1854. 3 months after her mother's first marriage to Judge Bly. "She was already married when she wed my father," Clara said, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Which means their marriage was never legal, which means I'm—" "Hey," Everett's voice was firm. "Look at me." Clara raised her eyes to meet his. "What your mother did 20 years ago doesn't change who you are or what you're worth. You're Clara Sutton, daughter of the people who raised you and loved you and taught you to be strong. A piece of paper doesn't change that." But Clara's mind was racing through the legal implications. If my parents' marriage wasn't valid, then my father's will might not be valid either. Judge Bly could claim that as my mother's legal husband, he's my guardian. He could claim the ranch through me. The marriage certificate trembled in her hands as the full scope of Judge Bly's plan became clear. He hadn't been trying to court her, he'd been trying to reclaim what he saw as his stolen property. Her mother's flight to marry another man, Clara's very existence, the ranch that had been built on land that Elizabeth had helped choose, all of it was, in his mind, rightfully his. "There's more," Everett said, pulling another document from the file. "Look at this." It was a death certificate for Elizabeth Sutton Bly, dated 2 days after Clara's mother had actually died. But this certificate listed the cause of death as accidental drowning, rather than the fever that had actually taken her life. "He falsified her death record," Clara breathed, "made it look like she died of drowning, so he could claim she'd face his water justice for deserting him." "Sick bastard," Everett muttered. "He's been planning this for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what he thinks is his." Clara sank into a wooden chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Her entire life had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies, and now Judge Bly's obsession with her made terrible sense. In his twisted mind, she wasn't just a young woman who'd rejected his proposal. She was the daughter of a wife who'd betrayed him, living on land that belonged to him by right of marriage. "Why didn't she tell my father?" Clara asked. "Why keep such a dangerous secret?" Everett studied the documents carefully. "Look at this, there's a note attached to the marriage certificate." The note was in Elizabeth's handwriting, though Clara barely recognized the shaky script, so different from her mother's usual careful penmanship. "H has threatened to kill both Thomas and the baby if I ever reveal our marriage. I pray God will forgive me for living this lie, but I cannot sacrifice innocent lives for the sake of honesty. If anything happens to me, Thomas must take Clara far from this place. H will never stop hunting what he believes belongs to him. E.S." "She was protecting you," Everett said softly, "and protecting your father. She knew what kind of man Judge Bly was, knew he'd kill anyone who stood between him and what he wanted." Clara felt tears burning her eyes of grief for her mother's sacrifice and terror at the realization of how much danger she'd been in her entire life without knowing it. "The fever that killed her," Clara said slowly. "Do you think it was really fever?" Everett's jaw tightened. "Given what we know about Judge Bly now, I wouldn't bet on it." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Judge Bly had been waiting, biding his time, letting Clara grow up, believing she was safe while he consolidated his power in Sagebrush Crossing. Her father's death from consumption had provided the perfect opportunity to finally claim his prize. "We have to get out of here," Everett said, looking toward the courthouse stairs. "If Judge Bly finds us with these documents—" "No," Clara's voice was suddenly strong again. "We're not running. This changes everything, don't you see? We finally have proof of what he really is. Clara, if he's been planning this for 20 years, if he killed your mother and maybe your father too, he's not going to hesitate to kill us both." "Maybe. But now we know why he's so determined to get the ranch. It's not just greed, it's obsession. And obsessed men make mistakes." Clara carefully folded the marriage certificate and death record, placing them in her saddlebag alongside her father's land deed. "These documents prove that Judge Bly has been falsifying records, that his authority extends far beyond what's legal, that he's been planning this for decades. They also prove that he has a legal claim to you and your property. Only if people accept that a forced marriage to a teenage girl 20 years ago gives him current rights over her daughter. And only if they're willing to overlook murder, fraud, and corruption to enforce those rights." Everett looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to stop reacting to Judge Bly's moves and start making some of our own. He's been playing a long game, but he's been playing it in secret. What happens when we drag all his secrets into the light? He tries to kill us before we can expose him. Then we'd better move fast." Clara headed toward the stairs. "And we'd better make sure the whole territory knows what's been happening in Sagebrush Crossing before he gets the chance." As they left the courthouse in the pre-dawn darkness, Clara felt the weight of the hidden marriage certificate in her saddlebag like a physical burden. The truth about her family's past was more complicated and dangerous than she'd ever imagined, but it was also the key to understanding Judge Bly's vulnerability. He'd built his power on secrets and fear, on the assumption that no one would ever uncover his carefully hidden crimes. But now those secrets were exposed, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Clara felt like she held weapons that could actually hurt him. The question was whether she'd have the chance to use them before Judge Bly decided that 20 years of patience was long enough, and that it was time to claim his prize by force. Clara's mother's wedding ring caught the morning sunlight as Clara turned it slowly in her palm, studying the simple gold band that had hidden such devastating secrets. She'd found it among her mother's belongings after returning from the courthouse, wrapped in a handkerchief along with a letter she'd never seen before. The letter, written in her mother's careful script, was addressed, "To my daughter, when she is old enough to understand. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then the truth about my first marriage has somehow come to light. I pray it never will, But if it has, you must know that every choice I made was to protect you and your father from a man who sees love as ownership and marriage as conquest. The ring I wear was given to me by Thomas, your true father, in every way that matters. But this ring, my first wedding ring, I keep as a reminder of the price of innocence lost. Judge Bly is not a man who forgives or forgets. If he ever learns the truth about our family, you must run far from this place and never return. Some battles cannot be won, only survived. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. Everett read the letter over Clara's shoulder as they sat in her kitchen. The recovered documents spread across the table like evidence in a trial that might determine their lives. The marriage certificate, the falsified death record, her father's land deed, and now this final piece of her mother's tragic puzzle. She was wrong about one thing, Clara said quietly. What's that? She said some battles cannot be won, only survived. But surviving isn't enough anymore. Not when Judge Bly is still out there, still threatening other families, still destroying lives whenever someone crosses him. Through the kitchen window, they could see riders approaching Morrison and Mrs. Patterson, along with 3 other townspeople Clara recognized but had never expected to see at her ranch. Word of their courthouse discovery had spread quickly through the careful network of whispered conversations that connected Sagebrush Crossing's more thoughtful residents. They're taking a big risk coming here, Everett observed. They're taking a bigger risk staying silent. The group that gathered in Clara's kitchen represented the closest thing to organized opposition that Judge Bly had faced in his 10 years of rule. Morrison brought news that the judge had increased patrols around the town, posted guards at the courthouse, and begun questioning anyone seen talking to Clara or Everett. Mrs. Patterson reported that she'd been officially suspended from her teaching position, though the school board had done so reluctantly and with obvious discomfort. "He's getting desperate," said Tom Bradley, a farmer whose land bordered Clara's ranch. "Yesterday, he tried to claim that my fence repairs were actually property encroachment, demanded I pay fines or face prosecution." "Same here," added Mary Walsh, whose late husband had left her a small general store. "Suddenly, my business license needs review, and my inventory is suspicious. 20 years I've run that store without a single complaint." Clara spread the documents on the table, watching their faces as they absorbed the implications of what she and Everett had discovered. The hidden marriage certificate drew gasps of shock, while the falsified death record prompted angry muttering about the extent of Judge Bly's deception. "This explains everything," Morrison said grimly. "Why he's so fixated on your ranch, why he's willing to kill to get it. In his mind, he's not stealing, he's reclaiming stolen property." "The question is what we do with this information," Mrs. Patterson said. "If we confront him publicly, he'll deny everything and claim the documents are forgeries. Or he'll accelerate his timeline and try to eliminate the evidence," Everett added, "along with anyone who's seen it." Clara looked around the table at these brave people who'd risked their safety to oppose injustice. They were ordinary folks, a livery stable owner, a school teacher, a farmer, a shopkeeper, but they represented something Judge Bly had tried to destroy in Sagebrush Crossing, the community's conscience. "There's a territorial circuit rider due through here next week," Tom Bradley said. "Judge Morrison from the capital making his quarterly rounds. If we could get these documents to him." "Judge Bly will know he's coming," Clara interrupted. "He'll have a week to hide evidence, intimidate witnesses, maybe even arrange an accident for anyone who might testify against him." "Then what do you suggest?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Clara fingered her mother's wedding ring, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets and lies. "I suggest we stop playing defense and start playing offense. Judge Bly has spent 10 years making this community afraid of him. It's time he learned what it feels like to be afraid." "What did you have in mind?" Morrison asked. "Sunday meeting is in 3 days. The whole town will be there, including Judge Bly. What if we use that gathering to present our evidence publicly, in front of everyone?" "He'll try to stop us," Mary Walsh warned. "Let him try, in front of the entire community, with witnesses from every family in town. He can't murder all of us in broad daylight without destroying his cover completely." Everett studied Clara's face with concern. "You're talking about forcing a final confrontation. Once we do this, there's no going back. Judge Bly will have to either surrender his power or destroy us completely." "I know." Clara met his eyes. "But we can't keep living in fear, and we can't keep letting him hurt innocent people. My mother spent 20 years running from the truth, and it killed her in the end anyway. I won't make the same mistake." The group spent the next 2 hours planning their approach. Morrison would quietly spread word among the more trustworthy townspeople, preparing them for what was coming. Mrs. Patterson would use her connections with the families whose children she'd taught to build support. Tom Bradley and Mary Walsh would coordinate with other business owners who'd suffered under Judge Bly's increasingly arbitrary demands. But the real burden would fall on Clara and Everett. They would have to stand before the community, present the evidence, and somehow convince frightened people to find the courage to act. "There's something else we need to consider," Everett said as the meeting was breaking up. "Judge Bly won't just sit still while we organize against him. He's going to make his own moves, probably sooner rather than later." Clara nodded. "I know. He's been patient for 20 years, but seeing his secrets exposed will drive him to desperation. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Clara looked down at her mother's ring, thinking about the woman who'd worn it while living a lie to protect her family. Elizabeth Sutton had sacrificed her peace, her honesty, and ultimately her life to keep Clara safe. Now it was Clara's turn to choose between safety and justice. "I'm prepared," she said simply. That evening, as the others dispersed to their homes and their careful preparations, Clara and Everett remained at the ranch, making their own plans for the confrontation to come. They cleaned weapons, reviewed the documents one more time, and tried to anticipate every possible way Judge Bly might try to stop them. "You know, this might not work," Everett said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Even if we expose everything, even if the community turns against him, Judge Bly might decide that killing us is worth the risk." "I know." Clara slipped her mother's ring onto her finger, where it sat beside the simple band her father had given Elizabeth. "But my mother lived in fear for 20 years, and it didn't save her. My father asked the right questions and died anyway. At some point, you have to choose between living safely and living with honor. And if we don't survive Sunday—" Clara looked at him with eyes that held both determination and peace. "Then at least we'll die trying to do what's right, and maybe that will inspire someone else to keep fighting." Everett was quiet for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his daughter's faded blue ribbon, tying it gently around Clara's wrist. "For courage," he said softly. Clara touched the ribbon with her free hand, feeling the connection between past and present, between love lost and love found, between the daughter Everett had failed to protect and the woman he was choosing to stand beside now. "For courage," she agreed. In the distance, they could see lights flickering in the windows of Sagebrush Crossing, each one representing a family that would have to choose in just 3 days between fear and freedom. The outcome was far from certain, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Clara felt like they had a real chance to win. Judge Bly had spent 10 years teaching the community to be afraid. Now it was time to teach him the same lesson. The Sagebrush Crossing Town Charter hung in its frame on the church wall, its faded text barely legible after 12 years of prairie dust and Sunday morning sunlight. But Clara had memorized the relevant passages during her sleepless preparation for this moment. "All citizens shall be governed by territorial law and territorial authority alone, with no individual granted power beyond that specifically designated by territorial statute." Judge Bly had violated that charter in dozens of ways over the past decade, but today Clara intended to use it as the foundation for his downfall. The church filled slowly as families arrived for Sunday meeting, their faces marked by the particular tension of people who sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. Word had spread through the careful network Morrison and Mrs. Patterson had built. and most of the congregation understood that this wouldn't be an ordinary service. Judge Bly sat in his customary front pew, flanked by his two enforcers, but Clara noticed subtle changes in his usual commanding presence. His silver hair was perfectly groomed as always, but his pale eyes kept scanning the room with the wariness of a man who knew his enemies were gathering strength. "He knows something's coming," Everett murmured as they took seats in the back row. Clara nodded, her hand resting on the saddlebag that contained the documents that would either free Sagebrush Crossing or get them both killed. Her mother's wedding ring caught the morning light streaming through the windows, and she drew strength from the weight of it on her finger. Pastor Williams began the service with obvious nervousness, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the careful speech of a man walking through a minefield. He'd been told what to expect, but Clara could see that the prospect of defying Judge Bly in his own church had shaken the elderly preacher's resolve. "Before we begin our regular worship," Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "Miss Clara Sutton has requested permission to address the congregation on a matter of community importance." Judge Bly's head snapped around, his eyes fixing on Clara with unmistakable fury. "Pastor Williams, this is highly irregular. The church is not an appropriate forum for secular disputes." "With respect, Judge," Clara said, rising from her seat, "this isn't a secular matter. This is about justice, truth, and the moral foundations of our community. I believe that makes it very much a church matter." A murmur ran through the congregation as Clara made her way to the front of the church, Everett beside her. She could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, some sympathetic, others fearful, all focused on the young woman who had somehow survived Judge Bly's attempt to murder her. "Citizens of Sagebrush Crossing," Clara began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For 10 years, you have lived under the rule of a man who claims to represent justice and order. Today, I'm here to show you the truth about Judge Horace Bly and the corruption that has poisoned our community." "This is outrageous," Judge Bly said, rising from his pew. "I will not sit here and listen to slander from a disturbed young woman who has already demonstrated her contempt for lawful authority." "Then perhaps you'd prefer to explain these documents yourself," Clara said, withdrawing the marriage certificate from her saddlebag. The effect was immediate. Judge Bly's face went ashen as he recognized the paper that had been hidden in his courthouse basement for 20 years. Several people in the congregation leaned forward, straining to see what Clara was holding. "This is a marriage certificate," Clara announced, "dated June 15th, 1854, between Judge Horace Bly and my mother, Elizabeth Sutton, 3 months before she married the man I knew as my father." Gasps of shock rippled through the church. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, while Morrison gripped the back of his pew with white knuckles. "That document is a forgery," Judge Bly said quickly, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Is it?" Clara held up the second document. "Then perhaps you can explain this death certificate for Elizabeth Sutton Bly, filed 2 days after my mother's actual death, and listing the cause as accidental drowning, rather than the fever that actually killed her." The congregation's shocked murmurs grew louder. Judge Bly's enforcers shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, but the crowd's attention made them hesitate. "Judge Bly didn't sentence me to water justice because I committed any crime," Clara continued. "He sentenced me to death because he believes I belong to him, that my mother's desertion 20 years ago gives him legal claim to me and my ranch." "You have no proof of these wild accusations," Judge Bly said, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Clara reached into her saddlebag again and withdrew the town charter from its frame on the wall. "Actually, I have this. The founding charter of Sagebrush Crossing, which clearly states that all authority must derive from territorial statute. Water justice appears nowhere in territorial law, Judge Bly. You invented it as a way to murder anyone who threatened your power." Pastor Williams found his voice. "Judge, is this true? Does water justice have any legal foundation?" For the first time in 10 years, Judge Bly had no ready answer. the silence stretched through the church, broken only by the sound of children fidgeting and the distant call of a meadowlark outside. "The law is complex," he finally said. "These matters require understanding beyond what ordinary citizens possess." "The law is not complex," Mrs. Patterson said, standing in her pew. "Murder is murder, regardless of what you call it or how you dress it up in legal language." "Exactly," Morrison added, also rising. "We've been letting fear turn us into accomplices to crimes that would horrify us anywhere else." More voices joined the chorus of condemnation as the spell of fear that had held Sagebrush Crossing for so long finally began to break. Judge Bly looked around the church with growing desperation, seeing his authority crumble in real time. "Enough!" he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "I have maintained order in this community for 10 years. I have protected you from chaos, from the lawlessness that plagues other territories. And this is how you repay me? By listening to the lies of a hysterical girl and her drifter accomplice." "We repay you," Clara said quietly, "by demanding that you answer for your crimes." Judge Bly's hand moved to his coat, where Clara knew he kept a pistol. But before he could draw it, Everett stepped forward, his own weapon already in his hand, but pointed at the floor. "I wouldn't if I were you," Everett said calmly. "Too many witnesses, too many people who finally found their courage." Judge Bly looked around the church one more time, seeing fear replaced by anger on face after face. These were the same people who'd watched him throw Clara into the Snake River just days ago, but something fundamental had changed in them. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." But as he and his enforcers pushed through the crowd toward the church door, Clara knew that it was over at least the first phase. Judge Bly's authority was broken, his secrets exposed, his power over the community shattered. The question now was what he would do with nothing left to lose. Everett's father's pocket watch showed exactly noon when Judge Bly returned to the church with a dozen armed men at just his usual enforcers, but hired gunmen from outside the territory who owed no loyalty to Sagebrush Crossing or its people. The silver timepiece had belonged to 3 generations of coalmen, each of whom had faced moments when doing right required risking everything. The congregation was still debating what to do with the evidence Clara had presented when the church doors burst open. Judge Bly strode down the center aisle with the bearing of a man who had decided that if he couldn't rule through fear and legal authority, he would rule through force alone. "Citizens of Sagebrush Crossing," he announced, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute power, "you have chosen rebellion over order, chaos over stability. I had hoped to avoid this unpleasantness, but your actions have forced my hand." His hired gunmen spread out along the walls of the church, their weapons drawn but pointed at the floor, a clear threat, without the immediate provocation of aimed guns. The families trapped inside looked around desperately, realizing they were caught in a situation that had escalated far beyond anything they'd anticipated. "Let these people go," Clara said, stepping forward. "Your quarrel is with me, not with them." "My quarrel," Judge Bly said, "is with anyone who threatens the order I've spent 10 years building. But you're right that it started with you, Miss Sutton, or should I say Miss Bly." The name hung in the air like a curse. By using it publicly, Judge Bly was making his claim, official asserting his legal right to Clara and her property based on his marriage to her mother. "My name is Clara Sutton," she said firmly, "daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Sutton, who raised me and loved me and taught me the difference between justice and tyranny." "Your mother was Elizabeth Bly," the judge corrected. "My legal wife, who stole herself and my property when she ran away with another man. You are my stepdaughter, and this ranch belongs to me by right of marriage." Everett moved closer to Clara, his hand resting on his pistol. The pocket watch in his vest seemed to tick louder in the tense silence, marking moments that felt like hours. "Even if that were true," Pastor Williams said with surprising courage, "it wouldn't give you the right to terrorize this community or murder innocent people, wouldn't it?" Judge Bly's smile was cold. "I am the law in Sagebrush Crossing. I have been for 10 years. and the law gives me the authority to maintain order by whatever means necessary." "Not anymore," Morrison said, standing up despite the guns pointed in his direction. "We know what you really are now. We know about the murders, the falsified records, the abuse of power. Your authority ended the moment Clara showed us those documents." Judge Bly laughed a sound without humor or warmth. "My authority, Mr. Morrison, comes from these men and their guns. Legal documents matter only when there are courts to enforce them and people alive to read them." The threat was unmistakable. Judge Bly was prepared to massacre the entire congregation if necessary to maintain his grip on power. "You're talking about murdering 30 innocent people," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking but determined. "Women and children who've done nothing but listen to the truth." "I'm talking about removing obstacles to the natural order," Judge Bly replied. "Some lessons must be taught with blood, Mrs. Patterson. The people of this territory need to understand what happens when lawful authority is challenged." Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people, her friends, her neighbors, families with children, were in mortal danger because she'd chosen to fight back instead of accepting Judge Bly's claims. "There's another way," she said quietly. "Is there? Trial by combat. Single combat between you and me, with the winner taking all, an old tradition that even territorial law recognizes in cases of disputed authority." Judge Bly's eyes lit up with interest. The concept of trial by combat was indeed recognized in territorial statutes, a holdover from older legal traditions that allowed personal disputes to be settled through individual contests rather than prolonged legal proceedings. "You would face me in single combat for the right to your freedom and property?" "I would, but not just for my freedom, for the freedom of this entire community. If I win, you leave Sagebrush Crossing forever and never return. If you win, I'll accept your authority and your claim to my family's ranch." The congregation stirred uneasily. Several people started to object, but Clara raised her hand for silence. "The combat doesn't have to be to the death," she continued. "First blood or submission, witnessed by the entire community." Judge Bly considered this, his calculating mind weighing the options. He was larger than Clara, stronger, and certainly more experienced with violence. Single combat would give him the legal victory he needed, while eliminating the witness problem of killing an entire church full of people. "Single combat then," he agreed, "but I choose the weapons and the terms." "Agreed. Pistols at 20 paces. To the death." Clara's heart sank. She was a fair shot with a rifle for hunting, but Judge Bly had been in gunfights before. At 20 paces with pistols, his experience and steadier nerves would give him an overwhelming advantage. But before she could accept the deadly terms, Everett stepped forward. "I invoke the right of substitution," he said clearly. Judge Bly frowned. "What?" "Territorial law allows a champion to stand in place of someone unable to fight their own battles. As Miss Sutton's chosen protector, I claim the right to face you in her place." Clara started to object, but Everett's eyes silenced her. In them, she saw 15 years of guilt and regret, a man who had failed to protect his own daughter and would not fail to protect her. "Very well," Judge Bly said after a moment. "Pistols at 20 paces. To the death. The winner claims Miss Sutton and her property." The church emptied slowly as people filed outside to witness the combat that would determine Sagebrush Crossing's future. Clara walked beside Everett, her heart breaking at the thought of losing him just when she'd found someone worth fighting for. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes, I do," Everett replied, checking his father's pocket watch one more time. "I've been running from the right fight for 15 years. Time to stop running." In the dusty street outside the church, under the noon sun that cast sharp shadows across the prairie, two men prepared to settle 20 years of corruption and cruelty with gunpowder and lead. Judge Bly, confident in his superior skill and experience, Everett Cole, fighting not just for Clara's freedom, but for his own redemption. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Everett's vest. marking the final moments before he would either save the woman he'd come to love or join his daughter in whatever waited beyond the prairie sky. The new deed of partnership lay spread across Clara's kitchen table 6 months later, its fresh ink declaring the legal union of the Sutton and Cole ranches under joint ownership. The document represented more than a business arrangement. It was a testament to how much had changed in Sagebrush Crossing since that dusty noon when Everett Cole had faced Judge Horace Bly in the street outside the church. Clara traced the signatures with her finger, remembering the moment when the gunshot had echoed across the prairie and Judge Bly had fallen, clutching his shoulder where Everett's bullet had found its mark. The corrupt judge had lived, but his defeat had been as complete as if he'd died. His hired gunmen had scattered, his authority had crumbled, and within a week he'd been escorted out of the territory by federal marshals who'd finally learned what had been happening in their isolated community. The trial that followed had been swift and decisive. With the evidence Clara and Everett had gathered, along with testimony from dozens of townspeople who finally found the courage to speak, Judge Bly had been convicted of fraud, corruption, and multiple counts of murder. He would spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison, his dreams of power and revenge reduced to the bitter memories of a broken man. "You're thinking about him again," Everett said, entering the kitchen with mud on his boots and satisfaction on his weathered face. 6 months of regular meals and peaceful sleep had filled out his frame slightly, though he still carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Just thinking about how different everything is now," Clara replied, folding the partnership deed carefully. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's over." Everett poured himself coffee from the pot that always seemed to be warming on Clara's stove, a domestic comfort he was still getting accustomed to after 15 years of campfire coffee and solitary meals. "Morrison stopped by this morning," he said. "The territorial government has approved his appointment as the new territorial magistrate for this district. Judge Morrison, he'll be now." Clara smiled at the news. Morrison had proven himself during the crisis, standing up to corruption despite his fears, and helping to build the coalition that had finally brought Judge Bly down. His appointment as the official replacement was a victory for everyone who believed in justice over tyranny. "Mrs. Patterson will be pleased," Clara said. "She's been worried about who they'd send to replace Bly. Speaking of Mrs. Patterson, she wanted me to tell you that the new schoolhouse is almost finished. The Territorial Education Board was so impressed with how the community handled the crisis that they approved funding for a proper building. The new schoolhouse was one of many improvements that had come to Sagebrush Crossing in the months following Judge Bly's downfall. Without the corrupt judge siphoning off territorial funds and discouraging outside investment, the community had begun to prosper in ways that had been impossible during his reign of fear. Clara stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out over the land that had cost her family so much pain, but had ultimately brought her the greatest happiness she'd ever known. The ranch was thriving under joint management, with Everett's expertise with horses complementing her knowledge of cattle and farming. But more than that, the partnership had given both of them something they'd lost. Everett had found a reason to stay in one place, while Clara had found someone who understood her determination to fight for what was right. "The circuit rider brought news from the territorial capital," Everett continued, settling into the chair across from where she stood. "They're creating a new position, territorial investigator, someone whose job is to travel between communities and make sure local officials aren't abusing their authority." "Good," Clara said firmly. "What happened here should never happen anywhere else." Through the window, she could see riders approaching the ranch. Morrison and his wife, Mrs. Patterson, Tom Bradley, and several other families from town. It had become a Sunday tradition for the community to gather at the Sutton Cole Ranch for dinner and conversation, a way of strengthening the bonds that had been tested but not broken during their trial by fire. "They're coming for Sunday dinner," Clara observed. "I should start preparing." But she made no move to leave the window, content for the moment to watch their friends approach and to feel the deep satisfaction of belonging to a community that had chosen courage over fear. "Clara," Everett said quietly. She turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on his face. I've been thinking about Sarah lately, about what she might have thought of all this. Clara moved to sit beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. What do you think she would have said? I think she would have been proud that her old man finally stopped running away from the fight that mattered. Everett's voice was soft but steady. I think she would have liked you very much. I would have liked her too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands joined, thinking about the daughter who had died too young and the woman who had lived long enough to help her father find redemption. The sound of horses in the yard broke the peaceful moment, followed by the cheerful voices of friends gathering for their weekly celebration of community and survival. Clara rose to greet their guests, but paused in the doorway to look back at Everett. "Are you happy?" she asked. Everett considered the question seriously, looking around the kitchen that had become more of a home to him than anywhere he'd lived since Sarah's death. The partnership deed on the table, the sound of friends arriving, the woman who had shown him that it was never too late to choose love over loneliness, all of it, added up to something he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm happy." Clara smiled and went to welcome their guests, her heart full of gratitude for the strange series of events that had brought such joy out of such darkness. Judge Bly had intended to destroy her life, but instead his cruelty had led her to discover strength she hadn't known. She possessed and love she hadn't dared to hope for. As the afternoon progressed and the kitchen filled with laughter and conversation, Clara found herself thinking about her parents, both sets of them, Thomas and Elizabeth Sutton, who had raised her with love and integrity, despite the secrets they'd been forced to keep. And somewhere in the territorial prison, the man whose obsession had nearly destroyed everything they'd built. But even Judge Bly's shadow couldn't diminish the brightness of this new life she and Everett were building together. They had chosen each other, chosen their community, chosen to fight for justice, even when the cost seemed too high to pay. The partnership deed on the table represented more than shared ownership of land and livestock. It was a declaration that some bonds were stronger than law, that some fights were worth the risk, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering enemies, but from building something better in the ruins they left behind. As the sun set over the prairie and their friends prepared to return to their homes, Clara stood beside Everett on the porch they now shared, watching the sky paint itself in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to choose between what was easy and what was right. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of community and the strength of love freely given, Clara Sutton Cole felt rich beyond measure. She had her land, her freedom, her friends, and the man who had risked everything to save her from the river that was meant to be her grave. Judge Bly had taught Sagebrush Crossing to be afraid, but Clara and Everett had taught them something more powerful. They had taught them to hope. The partnership deed rustled in the evening breeze, its signatures catching the last light of the setting sun, a testament to the truth that some stories end not with conquest, but with the quiet triumph of two hearts choosing to face whatever comes next together.